Chapter number 61 of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Coos. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 61 The Storm. The dawn of the following day was dark and gloomy, and as everyone knew that the promenade was down in the royal programme, everyone's gaze, as his eyes were opened, was directed towards the sky. Just above the tops of the trees, a thick, suffocating vapor seemed to remain suspended, with barely sufficient power to rise 30 feet above the ground, under the influence of the sun's rays, which was scarcely visible as a faint spot of lesser darkness through the veil of heavy mist. No dew had fallen in the morning. The turf was dried up for want of moisture. The flowers withered. The birds sang less inspiringly than usual upon the boughs, which remained motionless as the limbs of corpses. The strange, confused, and animated murmurs, which seemed born and to exist in the virtue of the sun, that respiration of nature which is unceasingly heard amidst all other sounds, could not be heard now, and never had the silence been so profound. The king had noticed the cheerless aspect of the heavens as he approached the window immediately upon rising, but as all the necessary directions had been given respecting the promenade, and every preparation had been made accordingly, and as, which was far more imperious than anything else, Louis relied upon this promenade to satisfy the cravings of his imagination, and we will even already say the clamorous desires of his heart, the king unhesitatingly decided that the appearance of the heavens had nothing whatever to do with the matter, that the promenade was arranged, and that, whatever the state of the weather, the promenade should take place. Besides, there are certain terrestrial sovereigns who seem to have accorded them privileged existences, and there are certain times when it might almost be supposed that the expressed wish of an earthly monarch has its influence over the divine will. It was Virgil who observed of Augustus, "Nocte pluie tota reduunt spectacula main." Louis attended mass as usual, but it was evident that his attention was somewhat distracted from the presence of the Creator by the remembrance of the creature. His mind was occupied during the service in reckoning more than once the number of minutes, then of seconds, which separated him from the blissful moment when the promenade would begin, that is to say, the moment when Madame would set out with her maids of honor. Besides, as a matter of course, everybody at the chateau was ignorant of the interview which had taken place between La Valliere and the king. Montalais, perhaps with her usual chattering propensity, might have been disposed to talk about it, but Montalais on this occasion was held in check by Malicorne, who had securely fastened on her pretty lips the golden padlock of mutual interest. As for Louis XIV, his happiness was so extreme that he had forgiven Madame, or nearly so, her little piece of malice of the previous evening. In fact, he had occasion to congratulate himself rather than to complain of it. Had it not been for her ill-natured action, he would not have received the letter from La Valliere. Had it not been for the letter, he would have had no interview, and had it not been for the interview, he would have remained undecided. His heart was filled with too much happiness for any ill feeling to remain in it, at that moment at the least. Instead, therefore, of knitting his brows into a frown when he perceived his sister-in-law, Louis resolved to receive her in a more friendly and gracious manner than usual, but on one condition only, that she would be ready to set out early. Such was the nature of Louis's thoughts during Mass, which made him, during the ceremony, forget matters which, in his character of most Christian king and the eldest son of the Church, ought to have occupied his attention. He returned to the chateau, and as the promenade was fixed for midday, and it was at present just 10 o'clock, he set to work desperately with Colbert and Léon. But even while he worked, Louis went from the table to the window, inasmuch as the window looked out upon Madame's pavilion. He could see Madame Fouquet in the courtyard, to whom the courtiers, since the favor shown towards him on the previous evening, paid greater attention than ever. The king, instinctively, on noticing Fouquet, turned towards Colbert, who was smiling, and seemed full of benevolence and delight, a state of feeling which had arisen from the very moment one of his secretaries had entered and handed him a pocket-book, which he had put unopened into his pocket. But, as there was always something sinister at the bottom of any delight expressed by Colbert, Louis preferred, of the smiles of the two men, that of Fouquet. He beckoned to the superintendent to come up, and turning towards Léon and Colbert, he said, "Finish this matter, place it on my desk, and I will read it at my leisure." And he left the room. At the sign the king had made to him, Fouquet had hastened up the staircase, while Aramis, who was with the superintendent, quietly retired among the group of courtiers, and disappeared without having been even observed by the king. The king and Fouquet met at the top of the staircase. "Sire," said Fouquet, remarking the gracious manner in which Louis was about to receive him, "your majesty has overwhelmed me with kindness during the last few days. It is not a youthful monarch, but a being of higher order who reigns over France, one whom pleasure, happiness, and love acknowledge as their master." The king colored. The compliment, although flattering, was not the less somewhat pointed. Louis conducted Fouquet to a small room that divided his study from his sleeping apartment. "Do you know why I summoned you?" said the king, as he seated himself upon the edge of the window, so as not to lose anything that might be passing in the gardens which fronted the opposite entrance to Madame's pavilion. "No, sire," replied Fouquet, "but I am sure for something agreeable, if I am to judge from your majesty's gracious smile." "You are mistaken, then." "I, sire? For I summoned you, on the contrary, to pick a quarrel with you." "With me, sire?" "Yes, and that a serious one." "Your majesty alarms me, and yet I was most confident in your justice and goodness. Do you know, I am told, Monsieur Fouquet, that you are preparing a grand fete at Vaux?" Fouquet smiled, as a sick man would do at the first shiver of a fever which has left him but returns again. "And that you have not invited me," continued the king. "Sire," replied Fouquet, I have not even thought of the fete you speak of, and it was only yesterday evening that one of my friends," Fouquet laid a stress upon the word, "was kind enough to make me think of it." "Yet I saw you yesterday evening, Monsieur Fouquet, and you said nothing to me about it. How dared I hope that your majesty would so greatly descend from your own exalted station as to honor my dwelling with your royal presence? Excuse me, Monsieur Fouquet, you did not speak to me about your fete." "I did not allude to the fete to your majesty, I repeat, in the first place, because nothing had been decided with regard to it, and secondly, because I feared a refusal." "And something made you fear a refusal, Monsieur Fouquet? You see, I am determined to push you hard. The profound wish I had that your majesty should accept my invitation—" "Well, Monsieur Fouquet, nothing is easier, I perceive, than our coming to an understanding. Your wish is to invite me to your fete. My own is to be present at it. Invite me, and I will go." "It is possible that your majesty will deign to accept," murmured the superintendent. "Why, really, monsieur," said the king, laughing, "I think I do more than accept. I rather fancy I am inviting myself." "Your majesty overwhelms me with honor and delight," exclaimed Fouquet; "but I shall be obliged to repeat what Monsieur Vieuville said to your ancestor Henry IV., 'Domine num sum dignus,' to which I reply, Monsieur Fouquet, that if you give a fete, I will go, whether I am invited or not." "I thank your majesty deeply," said Fouquet, as he raised his head beneath his favor, which he was convinced would be his ruin. "But how could your majesty have been informed of it?" "By a public rumor, Monsieur Fouquet, which says such wonderful things of yourself and the marvels of your house. Would you become proud, Monsieur Fouquet, if the king were to be jealous of you?" "I should be the happiest man in the world, sire, since the very day on which your majesty were to be jealous of Vaux, I should possess something worthy of being offered to you." "Very well, Monsieur Fouquet, prepare your fete, and open the door of your house as wide as possible. It is for your majesty to fix the day." "This day, month, then. Has your majesty any further commands?" "Nothing, Monsieur Fouquet, except from the present moment until then, to have you near me as much as possible." "I have the honor to form one of your majesty's party for the promenade." "Very good. Indeed, I am now setting out, for there are the ladies, I see, who are going to start." With this remark, the king, with all the eagerness, not only of a young man, but of a young man in love, withdrew from the window in order to take his gloves and cane, which his valet held ready for him. The neighing of the horses and the crunching of the wheels on the gravel of the courtyard could be distinctly heard. The king descended the stairs, and at the moment he appeared upon the flight of steps, everyone stopped. The king walked straight up to the young queen. The queen mother, who was still suffering more than ever from the illness with which she was afflicted, did not wish to go out. Maria Theresa accompanied Madame in her carriage, and asked the king in what direction he wished the promenade to drive. The king, who had just seen La Valliere, still pale from the event of the previous evening, get into a carriage with 3 of her companions, told the queen that he had no preference, and wherever she would like to go, there would he be with her. The queen then desired that the outrider should proceed in the direction of Apremont. The outrider set off accordingly before the others. The king rode on horseback, and for a few minutes accompanied the carriage of the queen and Madame. The weather had cleared up a little, but a kind of veil of dust, like a thick gauze, was still spread over the surface of the heavens, and the sun made every atom glisten with the circuit of its rays. The heat was stifling, but as the king did not seem to pay any attention to the appearance of the heavens, no one made himself uneasy about it, and the promenade, in obedience to the orders given by the queen, took its course in the direction of Apremont. The courtiers who followed were in the very highest spirits. It was evident that every one tried to forget, and to make others forget, the bitter discussions of the previous evening. Madame, particularly, was delightful. In fact, seeing the king at the door of her carriage, as she did not suppose he would be there for the queen's sake, she hoped that her prince had returned to her. Hardly, however, had they proceeded a quarter of a mile on the road when the king, with a gracious smile, saluted them and drew up his horse, leaving the queen's carriage to pass on, then that of the principal ladies of honor, and then all the others in succession, who, seeing the king stop, wished in their turn to stop too, but the king made a sign to them to continue their progress. When La Valliere's carriage passed, the king approached it, saluted the ladies who were inside, and was preparing to accompany the carriage containing the maids of honor, in the same way he had followed that in which Madame was, when suddenly the whole file of carriages stopped. It was probable that Madame, uneasy at the king having left her, had just given directions for the performance of this maneuver, the direction in which the promenade was to take place having been left up to her. The king, having sent to inquire what her object was in stopping the cavalcade, was informed in reply that she wished to walk. She most likely hoped that the king, who was following the carriages of the maids of honor on horseback, would not venture to follow the maids of honor themselves on foot. They had arrived in the middle of the forest. The promenade, in fact, was not ill-timed, especially for those who were dreamers or lovers. From the little open space where the halt had taken place, 3 beautiful long walks, shady and undulating, stretched out before them. These walks were covered with moss, or with leaves that formed a carpet from the loom of nature, and each walk had its horizon in the distance, consisting of about a handbreadth of sky, apparent through the interlacing of the branches of the trees. At the end of almost every walk, evidently in great tribulation and uneasiness, the startled deer were seen hurrying to and fro, first stopping for a moment in the middle of the path, and then, raising their heads, they fled with the speed of an arrow, or bounded into the depths of the forest, where they disappeared from view. Now and then a rabbit of philosophical mien might be noticed quietly sitting upright, rubbing his muzzle with his 4 paws, and looking and inquiringly, as though wondering whether all these people who were approaching in his direction, and who had just disturbed him in his meditations and his meal, were not followed by their dogs, or had their gun under their arms. All alighted from their carriages as soon as they observed that the queen was doing so. Maria Theresa took the arm of one of her ladies of honor, and, with a side glance towards the king, who did not perceive that he was in the slightest degree the object of the queen's attention, entered the forest by the first path before her. Two of the outsiders preceded her majesty with long poles, which they used for the purpose of putting the branches of the trees aside, or removing the bushes that might impede her progress. As soon as Madame alighted, she found the Comte de Guiche at her side, who bowed and placed himself at her disposal. Monsieur, delighted with the bath of the 2 previous days, had announced his preference for the river, and, having given de Guiche leave of absence, remained at the chateau with the Chevalier de Lorraine and Manicamp. He was not in the slightest degree jealous. He had been looked for to no purpose among those present, but as Monsieur was a man who thought a great deal of himself, and usually added very little to the general pleasure, his absence was rather a subject of satisfaction than regret. Everyone who had followed the example which the queen and Madame had set, doing just as they pleased, according as chance or fancy influenced them. The king, we have already observed, remained near La Valliere, and throwing himself off his horse, at the moment the door of her carriage was opened, he offered her his hand to alight. Montalais and Tonnet Charente immediately drew back and kept at a distance, the former from calculated, the latter from natural motives. There was this difference, however, between the two, that the one had withdrawn from a wish to please the king, the other for a very opposite reason. During the last half hour the weather had also undergone a change. The veil, which had been spread over the sky, as if driven by a blast of heated air, had become massed together in the western part of the heavens, and afterwards, as if driven by a current of air from the opposite direction, was now advancing slowly and heavily towards them. The approach of this storm could be felt, but as the king did not perceive it, no one thought it proper to do so. The promenade was therefore continued. Some of the company, with minds ill at ease on the subject, raised their eyes from time to time towards the sky. Others, even more timid still, walked about without wandering too far from the carriages, where they relied upon taking shelter in case the storm burst. The greater number of these, however, observing that the king fearlessly entered the wood with La Valliere, followed his majesty. The king, noticing this, took La Valliere's hand and led her to a lateral forest alley, where no one this time ventured to follow him. End of chapter 61, The Storm. Recording by John Coos. www.validateyourlife.com and johncoos.com. 62 of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Coos. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 62, The Shower of Rain. At this moment, and in the same direction too, that the king and La Valliere had taken, except that they were in the wood itself instead of following the path. Two men were walking together, utterly indifferent to the appearance of the heavens. Their heads were bent down in the manner of people occupied with matters of great moment. They had not observed either de Guiche or Madame, the king or La Valliere. Suddenly something fell through the air like a colossal sheet of flame, followed by a loud but distant rumbling noise. "Ah!" said one of them, raising his head, "here comes the storm. Let us reach our carriages, my dear D'Herblay." Aramis looked inquiringly at the heavens. "There is no occasion to hurry yet," he said, and then resuming the conversation where it had doubtless been interrupted, he said, "You were observing that the letter we wrote last evening must by this time have reached its destination?" "I was saying that she certainly has it." "Whom did you send it by?" "By my own servant, as I have already told you." "Did he bring back an answer?" "I have not seen him since. The young girl was probably in attendance on Madame, or was in her own room dressing, and he may have had to wait. Our time for leaving arrived, and we set off, of course. I cannot, therefore, know what is going on yonder." "Did you see the king before leaving?" "Yes." "How did he seem?" "Nothing could have passed off better, or worse, according as he be sincere or hypocritical." "And the fete?" "Will take place in a month." "He invited himself, you say?" "With a pertinacity in which I detected Colbert's influence. But has not last night removed your illusions?" "What illusions?" "With respect to the assistance you may be able to give me under these circumstances." "No, I have passed the night writing, and all my orders are given." "Do not conceal it from yourself, D'Herblay." "But the fete will cost some millions." "I will supply 6. Do you, on your side, get 2 or 3. "You are a wonderful man, my dear D'Herblay." Aramis smiled. "But," inquired Fouquet, with some remaining uneasiness, "how is it that while you are now squandering millions in this manner, a few days ago you did not pay the 50,000 francs to Baisemeaux out of your own pocket?" "Because a few days ago I was as poor as Job." "And today?" "Today I am wealthier than the king himself." "Very well," said Fouquet. "I understand men pretty well. I know you are incapable of forfeiting your word. I do not wish to wrest your secret from you, and so let us talk no more about it." At this moment a dull, heavy rumbling was heard, which suddenly developed into a violent clap of thunder. "Oh, oh!" said Fouquet, "I was right in what I said." "Come," said Aramis, "let us rejoin the carriages." "We shall not have time," said Fouquet, "for here comes the rain." In fact, as he spoke, and as if the heavens were opened, a shower of large drops of rain was suddenly heard pattering on the leaves about them. "We shall have time," said Aramis, "to reach the carriages before the foliage becomes saturated." "It will be better," said Fouquet, "to take shelter somewhere, in a grotto, for instance." "Yes, but where are we to find a grotto?" inquired Aramis. "I know one," said Fouquet, smiling, "not 10 paces from here." Then, looking round him, he added, "Yes, we are quite right." "You are very fortunate to have so good a memory," said Aramis, smiling in his turn. "But are you not afraid that your coachman, finding we do not return, will suppose we have taken another road back, and that he will not follow the carriages belonging to the court?" "Oh, there is no fear of that," said Fouquet. "Whenever I place my coachman and my carriage in any particular spot, nothing but an express order from the king could stir them. And more than that, too, it seems that we are not the only ones who have come so far, for I hear footsteps and the sound of voices." As he spoke, Fouquet turned round and opened with his cane a mass of foliage which hid the path from his view. Aramis's glance, as well as his own, plunged at the same moment through the aperture he had made. "A woman," said Aramis. "And a man," said Fouquet. "It is La Valliere and the king," they both exclaimed together. "Oh, oh!" said Aramis, "is his majesty aware of your cavern as well? I should not be astonished if he were, for he seems to be on very good terms with the dryads of Fontainebleau." "Never mind," said Fouquet, "let us get there. If he is not aware of it, we shall see what he will do if he should know it, as it has two entrances, so that whilst he enters by one, we can leave by the other." "Is it far?" said Aramis, "for the rain is beginning to penetrate." "We are there now," said Fouquet, as he pushed aside a few branches, and an excavation in the solid rock could be observed, hitherto concealed by heaths, ivy, and a thick covert of small shrubs. Fouquet led the way, followed by Aramis, but as the latter entered the grotto, he turned round, saying, "Yes, they are entering the wood, and see, they are bending their steps this way." "Very well, let us make room for them," said Fouquet, smiling and pulling Aramis by his cloak. "But I do not think the king knows of my grotto." "Yes," said Aramis, "they are looking about them, but it is only for a thicker tree." Aramis was not mistaken. The king's looks were directed upward and not around him. He held La Valliere's arm within his own and held her hand in his. La Valliere's feet began to sleep on the damp grass. Louis again looked round him with greater attention than before, and, perceiving an enormous oak with wide spreading branches, he hurriedly drew La Valliere beneath its protecting shelter. The poor girl looked round her on all sides, and seemed half afraid, half desirous of being followed. The king made her lean back against the trunk of the tree, whose vast circumference, protected by the thickness of the foliage, was as dry as if that moment the rain had not been falling in torrents. He himself remained standing before her with his head uncovered. After a few minutes, however, some drops of rain penetrated through the branches of the tree and fell on the king's forehead, who did not pay any attention to them. "Oh, sire!" murmured La Valliere, pushing the king's hat towards him, but the king simply bowed and determinedly refused to cover his head. "Now or never is the time to offer your place," said Fouquet in Aramis's ear. "Now or never is the time to listen, and not lose a syllable of what they may have said to each other," replied Aramis in Fouquet's ear. In fact, they both remained perfectly silent, and the king's voice reached them where they were. "Believe me," said the king, "I perceive, or rather I can imagine, your uneasiness. Believe me, I sincerely regret having isolated you from the rest of the company and brought you also to a spot where you will be inconvenienced by the rain. You are wet already, and perhaps cold too?" "No, sire." "And yet you tremble. I am afraid, sire, that my absence may be misinterpreted, at a moment, too, when all the others are reunited." "I would not hesitate to propose returning to the carriages. Mademoiselle de la Valliere, But pray look and listen, and tell me if it be possible to attempt to make the slightest progress at present." In fact, the thunder was still rolling, and the rain continued to fall in torrents. "Besides," continued the king, "no possible interpretation can be made which would be to your discredit. Are you not with the King of France? In other words, with the first gentleman of the kingdom?" "Certainly, sire," replied La Valliere, "and it is a very distinguished honor for me. It is not, therefore, for myself that I fear any interpretations that may be made." "For whom, then?" "For you, sire." "For me?" said the king, smiling. "I do not understand you." "Has your majesty already forgotten what took place yesterday evening in her royal highness's apartments?" "Oh, forget that, I beg, or allow me to remember it for no other purpose than to thank you once more for your letter and—" "Sire," interrupted La Valliere, "the rain is falling, and your majesty's head is uncovered. I entreat you not to think of anything but yourself." "Oh, I," said Valliere, smiling, "I am a country girl, accustomed to roaming through the meadows of the Loire and the gardens of Blois, whatever the weather may be. And as for my clothes," she added, looking at her simple muslin dress, "your majesty sees there is but little room for injury. Indeed, I have already noticed, more than once, that you owed nearly everything to yourself and nothing to your toilet. Your freedom from coquetry is one of your greatest charms in my eyes." "Sire, do not take me out better than I am, and say merely you cannot possibly be a coquette." "Why so?" "Because," said La Valliere, smiling, "I am not rich." "You admit, then," said the king quickly, "that you have a love for beautiful things?" "Sire, I only regard those things as beautiful which are within my reach. Everything which is too highly placed for me you are indifferent to, is foreign to me as being prohibited." "And I," said the king, "do not find that you are at my court on the footing you should be. The services of your family have not been sufficiently brought under my notice. The advancement of your family was cruelly neglected by my uncle." "On the contrary, sire, his Royal Highness the Duke of Orleans was always exceedingly kind toward Monsieur de Saint Remy, my stepfather. The services rendered were humble, and, properly speaking, our services have been adequately recognized. It is not everyone who is happy enough to find opportunities of serving his sovereign with distinction. I have no doubt at all that, if ever opportunities had been met with, my family's actions would have been as lofty as their loyalty was firm, but that happiness was never ours. In that case, Mademoiselle de la Valliere, it belongs to kings to repair the want of opportunity, and most delightedly do I undertake to repair, in your instance, and with the least possible delay, the wrongs of fortune towards you." "Nay, sire," cried La Valliere, eagerly, "leave things, I beg, as they are now." "Is it possible you refuse what I ought and what I wish to do for you?" "All I desired has been granted me, when the honor was conferred upon me of forming one of Madame's household." "But if you refuse for yourself, at least accept for your family." "Your generous intentions, sire, bewilder me and make me apprehensive, for in doing for my family what your kindness urges you to do, your majesty will raise up enemies for us, and enemies for yourself too." "Leave me in the ranks of middle life, sire. of all the feelings and sentiments I experience, leave me to enjoy the pleasing instinct of disinterestedness." "The sentiments you express," said the king, "are indeed admirable." "Quite true," murmured Aramis in Fouquet's ear, "and he cannot be accustomed to them." "But," replied Fouquet, "suppose she were to make a similar reply to my letter?" "True," said Aramis. "Let us not anticipate, but wait the conclusion." "And then, dear Monsieur d'Herblay," added the superintendent, hardly able to appreciate the sentiments which La Valliere had just expressed, "it is very often sound calculation to seem disinterested with monarchs." "Exactly what I was thinking this very minute," said Aramis. "Let us listen." The king approached nearer to La Valliere, and as the rain dripped more and more through the foliage of the oak, he held his hat over the head of the young girl, who raised her beautiful blue eyes towards the royal hat which sheltered her, and shook her head, sighing deeply as she did so. "What melancholy thought," said the king, "can possibly reach your heart when I place mine as a rampart before it?" "I will tell you, sire. I had already once before broached this question, which is so difficult for a young girl of my age to discuss, but your majesty imposed silence on me." "Your majesty belongs not to yourself alone. You are married, and every sentiment which would separate your majesty from the queen, in leading you to take notice of me, will be a source of profoundest sorrow for the queen." The king endeavored to interrupt the young girl, but she continued with a suppliant gesture. "The Queen Maria, with an attachment which can be well understood, follows with her eyes every step of your majesty which separates you from her. Happy enough in having had her fate united to your own, she weepingly implores heaven to preserve you to her, and is jealous of the faintest throb of your heart bestowed elsewhere." The king again seemed anxious to speak, but again did La Valliere venture to prevent him. "Would it not, therefore, be a most blamable action," she continued, "if your majesty, a witness of this anxious and disinterested affection, gave the queen any cause for jealousy? Forgive me, sire, for the expressions I have used. I well know it is impossible, or rather that it would be impossible, that the greatest queen of the world could be jealous of a poor girl like myself. But though a queen, she is still a woman, and her heart, like the rest of her sex, cannot close itself against the suspicions which such as are evilly disposed insinuate. For heaven's sake, sire, think no more of me. I am unworthy of your regard. Do you not know that in speaking as you have done, you change my esteem for you into the profoundest admiration? Sire, you assume my words to be contrary to the truth. You suppose me to be better than I really am, and attach a greater merit to me than God ever intended should be the case. Spare me, sire, for did I not know that your majesty was the most generous man in your kingdom, I should believe you were jesting." "You do not, I know, fear such a thing. I am quite sure of that," exclaimed Louis. "I shall be obliged to believe it if your majesty continues to hold such language towards me." "I am most happy, then," said the king, in a tone of regret which was not assumed. "I am the unhappiest prince in the Christian world, since I am powerless to induce my belief in my words, in one whom I love the best in the wide world, and who almost breaks my heart by refusing to credit my regard for her." "Oh, sire," said La Valliere, gently putting the king aside, who had approached nearer to her, "I think the storm has passed away now, and the rain has ceased." At the very moment, however, as the poor girl, fleeing as it were from her own heart, which doubtless throbbed but too well in unison with the king's, uttered these words, the storm undertook to contradict her. A dead white flash of lightning illumined the forest with a weird glare, and a peal of thunder, like a discharge of artillery, burst over their heads, as if the height of the oak that sheltered them had attracted the storm. The young girl could not repress a cry of terror. The king with one hand drew her towards his heart, and stretched the other above her head, as though to shield her from the lightning. A moment's silence ensued, as the group, delightful as everything young and loving is delightful, remained motionless, while Fouquet and Aramis contemplated it in attitudes as motionless as La Valliere and the king. "Oh, sire!" murmured La Valliere, "do you hear?" And her head fell upon his shoulder. "Yes," said the king, "you see the storm has not passed away." "It is a warning, sire." The king smiled. "Sire, it is the voice of heaven in anger." "Be it so," said the king. "I agree to accept that peal of thunder as a warning, and even as a menace, if, in 5 minutes from the present moment, it is renewed with equal violence. But if not, permit me to think that the storm is a storm simply, and nothing more." And the king, at the same moment, raised his head, as if to interrogate the heavens. But, as if the remark had been heard and accepted during the 5 minutes which elapsed after the burst of thunder which had alarmed them, no renewed peal was heard. And when the thunder was again heard, it was passing as plainly as if, during those same 5 minutes, the storm, put to flight, had traversed the heavens with the wings of the wind. "Well, Louis," said the king in a low tone of voice, "do you still threaten me with the anger of heaven? And since you wish to regard the storm as a warning, do you still believe it bodes misfortune?" The young girl looked up, and saw that while she had been talking, the rain had penetrated the foliage above them, and was trickling down the king's face. "Oh, sire, sire!" she exclaimed in accents of eager apprehensions, which greatly agitated the king. "Is it for me," she murmured, "that the king remains thus uncovered and exposed to the rain? What am I, then?" "You are, you perceive," said the king, "the divinity who dissipates the storm, and brings back fine weather." In fact, even as the king spoke, a ray of sunlight streamed through the forest, and caused the raindrops which rested upon the leaves, or fell vertically among the openings in the branches, to glisten like diamonds. "Sire," said La Valliere, almost overcome, but making a powerful effort over herself, "think of the anxieties your majesty will have to submit to on my account. At this very moment they are seeking you in every direction. The queen must be full of uneasiness, and—" "Madame! Oh, madame!" the young girl exclaimed, with an expression almost resembling terror. This name had a certain effect upon the king. He started, and disengaged himself from La Valliere, whom he had, till that moment, held pressed against his heart. He then advanced towards the path in order to look around, and returned, somewhat thoughtfully, to La Valliere. "Madame, did you say?" he remarked. "Yes, madame, she too is jealous," said La Valliere, with a marked tone of voice, and her eyes, so timorous in their expression, and so modestly fugitive in their glance, for a moment ventured to look inquiringly into the king's. "Still," returned Louis, making an effort over himself, "it seems to me that madame has no reason, no right to be jealous of me." "Alas!" murmured La Valliere. "Are you too," said the king, almost in a tone of reproach, "are you among those who think the sister has a right to be jealous of the brother?" "It is not for me, sire, to seek to penetrate your majesty's secrets." "You do believe it, then?" exclaimed the king. "I believe madame is jealous, sire," La Valliere replied firmly. "Is it possible," said the king with some anxiety, "that you have perceived it, then, from her conduct towards you? Have her manners in any way been such towards you that you can attribute them to the jealousy you speak of?" "Not at all, sire. I am of so little importance." "Oh, if it were really the case!" exclaimed Louis violently. "Sire," interrupted the young girl, "it has ceased raining. Someone is coming, I think." And, forgetful of all etiquette, she had seized the king by the arm. "Well," replied the king, "let them come. Who is there who would venture to think I had done wrong in remaining alone with Mademoiselle de la Valliere?" "For pity's sake, sire, they will think it strange to see you wet through in this manner, and that you should have run such risk for me." "I have simply done my duty as a gentleman," said Louis, "and woe to him who may fail in his, in criticizing his sovereign's conduct." In fact, at this moment a few eager and curious faces were seen in the walk, as if engaged in a search. Catching glimpses at last of the king and La Valliere, they seemed to have found what they were seeking. They were some of the courtiers who had been sent by the queen and madame, and uncovered themselves in token of having perceived his majesty. But Louis, notwithstanding La Valliere's confusion, did not quit his respectful and tender attitude. Then, when all the courtiers were assembled in the walk, when every one had been able to perceive the extraordinary mark of deference with which he had treated the young girl by remaining standing and bareheaded during the storm, he offered her his arm, led her towards the group who were waiting, recognized by an inclination of the head the respectful salutations which were paid him on all sides, and, still holding his hat in his hand, he conducted her to her carriage. And, as a few sparse drops of rain continued to fall, a last adieu of the vanishing storm, the other ladies, whom respect had prevented from getting into their carriages before the king, remained altogether unprotected by hood or cloak, exposed to the rain from which the king was protecting, as well as he was able, the humblest among them. The queen and madame must, like the others, have witnessed this exaggerated courtesy of the king. Madame was so disconcerted at it that she touched the queen with her elbow, saying at the same time, "Look there, look there." The queen closed her eyes as if she had been suddenly seized with a fainting spell. She lifted her hands to her face and entered her carriage, madame following her. The king again mounted his horse, and without showing a preference for any particular carriage door, he returned to Fontainebleau, the reins hanging over his horse's neck, absorbed in thought. As soon as the crowd had disappeared, and the sound of the horses and carriages grew fainter in the distance, and when they were certain, in fact, that no one could see them, Aramis and Fouquet came out of their grotto, and both of them, in silence, passed slowly on towards the walk. Aramis looked most narrowly, not only at the whole extent of the open space stretching out before and behind him, but even into the very depth of the wood. "Monsieur Fouquet," he said, when he had quite satisfied himself that they were alone, "we must get back, at any cost, that letter you wrote to La Valliere." "That will be easy enough," said Fouquet, "if my servant has not given it to her. In any case, it must be had, do you understand?" "Yes, the king is in love with the girl, you mean?" "Deeply, and what is worse is, that on her side the girl is passionately attached to him." "As much as to say that we must change our tactics, I suppose?" "Not a doubt of it. You have no time to lose. You must see La Valliere, and without thinking any more of becoming her lover, which is out of the question, you must declare yourself her most devoted friend and her most humble servant." "I will do so," replied Fouquet, and without the slightest feeling of disinclination, for she seems a good-hearted girl. "Or a very clever one," said Aramis, "but in that case, all the greater reason." Then he added, after a moment's pause, "If I am not mistaken, that girl will become the strongest passion of the king's life. Let us return to our carriage, and as fast as possible to the chateau." End of chapter 62, The Shower of Rain. Recording by John Thomas Coos, www.validateyourlife.com and johncoos.com.
"10 years later." This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 63. Toby. 2 hours after the superintendent's carriage had set off by Aramis's directions, conveying them both towards Fontainebleau with the fleetness of the clouds the last breath of the tempest was hurrying across the face of heaven, La Valliere was closeted in her own apartment, with a simple muslin wrapper around her, having just finished a slight repast, which was placed upon a marble table. Suddenly the door was opened, and a servant entered to announce Monsieur Fouquet, who had called to request permission to pay his respects to her. She made him repeat the message twice over, for the poor girl only knew Monsieur Fouquet by name, and could not conceive what business she could possibly have with the superintendent of finances. However, as he might represent the king, and after the conversation we have recorded it was very likely, she glanced at her mirror, drew out still more of the ringlets of her hair, and desired him to be admitted. La Valliere could not, however, refrain from a certain feeling of uneasiness. A visit from the superintendent was not an ordinary event in the life of any woman attached to the court. Fouquet, so notorious for his generosity, his gallantry, and his sensitive delicacy of feeling with regard to women generally, had received more invitations than he had requested audiences. In many houses, the presence of the superintendent had been significant of fortune; in many hearts, of love. Fouquet entered the apartment with a manner full of respect, presenting himself with that ease and gracefulness of manner which was the distinct characteristic of the men of eminence of that period, and which at the present day seems no longer to be understood, even through the interpretation of the portraits of the period in which the painter has endeavored to recall them to being. La Valliere acknowledged the ceremonious salutation which Fouquet addressed to her, by a gentle inclination of the head, and motioned him to a seat. But Fouquet, with a bow, said, "I will not sit down until you have pardoned me." "I?" asked La Valliere, "pardon what?" Fouquet fixed a most piercing look upon the young girl. and fancied he could perceive in her face nothing but the most unaffected surprise. "I observe," he said, "that you have as much generosity as intelligence, and I read in your eyes the forgiveness I solicit. A pardon pronounced by your lips is insufficient for me, and I need the forgiveness of your heart and mind." "Upon my honor, monsieur," said La Valliere, "I assure you most positively that I do not understand your meaning." "Again, that is a delicacy on your part which charms me," replied Fouquet, "and I see that you do not wish me to blush before you." "Blush? Blush before me? Why should you blush?" "Can I have deceived myself?" said Fouquet, "and can I have been happy enough not to have offended you by my conduct towards you?" "Really, monsieur," said La Valliere, shrugging her shoulders, "you speak in enigmas, and I suppose I am too ignorant to understand you." "Be it so," said Fouquet, "I will not insist. Tell me only, I entreat you, that I may rely upon your full and complete forgiveness." "I have but one reply to make to you, monsieur," said La Valliere, somewhat impatiently, "and I hope that that will satisfy you. If I knew the wrong you have done me, I would forgive you; and I now do so with still greater reason since I am ignorant of the wrong you allude to." Fouquet bit his lips, as Aramis would have done. "In that case," he said, "I may hope that, notwithstanding what has happened, our good understanding will remain undisturbed, and that you will kindly confer the favor upon me of believing in my respectful friendship." La Valliere fancied that she now began to understand, and said to herself, "I should not have believed M. Fouquet so eager to seek the source of a favor so very recent," and then added aloud, "Your friendship, monsieur? You offer me your friendship? The honor, on the contrary, is mine, and I feel overpowered by it." "I am aware," replied Fouquet, "that the friendship of the master may appear more brilliant and desirable than that of the servant, but I assure you the latter will be quite as devoted, quite as faithful, and altogether disinterested." La Valliere bowed; for in fact, the voice of the superintendent seemed to convey both conviction and real devotion in its tone, and she held out her hand to him, saying, "I believe you." Fouquet eagerly took hold of the young girl's hand. "You see no difficulty, therefore," he added, "in restoring me that unhappy letter?" "What letter?" inquired La Valliere. Fouquet interrogated her with his most searching gaze, as he had already done before; but the same ingenuous expressions, the same transparently candid look met his. "I am obliged to confess," he said, after this denial, "that your heart is the most delicate in the world, and I should not feel I was a man of honor and uprightness if I were to suspect anything from a woman so generous as yourself." "Really, Monsieur Fouquet," replied La Valliere, "it is with profound regret I am obliged to repeat that I absolutely understand nothing of what you refer to." "In fact, then, upon your honor, mademoiselle, you have not received any letter from me?" "Upon my honor, none," replied La Valliere, firmly. "Well, then, that is quite sufficient. Permit me, then, to renew the assurance of my utmost esteem and respect," said Fouquet. Then, bowing, he left the room to seek Aramis, who was waiting for him in his own apartment, and leaving La Valliere to ask herself whether the superintendent had not lost his senses. "Well," inquired Aramis, who was impatiently waiting Fouquet's return, "are you satisfied with the favorite?" "Enchanted," replied Fouquet. "She is a woman full of intelligence and fine feeling." "She did not get angry, then?" "Far from it. She did not even seem to understand." "To understand what?" "To understand that I had written to her." "She must, however, have understood you sufficiently to give the letter back to you, for I presume she returned it." "Not at all." "At least you satisfied yourself that she had burned it?" "My dear Monsieur d'Herblay, I have been playing at cross purposes for more than an hour, and, however amusing it may be, I begin to have had enough of this game. So understand me thoroughly. The girl pretended not to understand what I was saying to her. She denied having received any letter. Therefore, having positively denied its receipt, she was unable either to return or burn it." "Oh, ho!" said Aramis, with uneasiness. "What is this you tell me?" "I say that she swore most positively she had not received any letter." "That is too much! And did you not insist?" "On the contrary, I did insist, almost impertinently even." "And she persisted in her denial?" "Unhesitatingly." "And did she not contradict herself?" "Not once." "But in that case, then, you have left our letter in her hands?" "How could I do otherwise?" "Oh! it was a great mistake. What the deuce would you have done in my place? One could not force her, certainly, but it is very embarrassing. Such a letter ought not to remain in existence against us." "Oh, the young girl's disposition is generosity itself. I looked at her eyes, and I can read eyes well." You think she could be relied upon?" "From my heart I do." "Well, I think we are mistaken." "In what way?" "I think that, in point of fact, as she herself told you, she did not receive the letter." "What do you suppose?" "I suppose that, from some motive, of which we know nothing, your man did not deliver the letter to her." Fouquet rang the bell. A servant appeared. "Send Toby here," he said. A moment afterwards a man made his appearance, with an anxious, restless look, shrewd expression of the mouth, with short arms, and his back somewhat bent. Aramis fixed a penetrating look upon him. "Will you allow me to interrogate him myself?" inquired Aramis. "Do so," said Fouquet. Aramis was about to say something to the lackey, when he paused. "No," he said, "he would see that we attach too much importance to his answer. Therefore question him yourself. I will pretend to be writing." Aramis accordingly placed himself at a table, his back turned towards the old attendant, whose every gesture and look he watched in a looking glass opposite to him. "Come here, Toby," said Fouquet to the valet, who approached with a tolerably firm step. "How did you execute my commission?" inquired Fouquet. "In the usual way, monsieur," replied the man. "But how, tell me?" "I succeeded in penetrating as far as Mademoiselle de la Valliere's apartment, but she was at mass, and so I placed the note on her toilette table." "Is not that what you told me to do?" "Precisely. And is that all?" "Absolutely all, monsieur." "No one was there?" "No one." "Did you conceal yourself as I told you?" "Yes." "And she returned?" 10 minutes afterwards." "And no one could have taken the letter?" "No one, for no one had entered the room." "From the outside?" "But from the interior. From the place where I was secreted, I could see to the very end of the room." "Now listen to me," said Fouquet, looking fixedly at the lackey. "If this letter did not reach its proper destination, confess it; for, if a mistake has been made, your head shall be forfeit." Toby started, but immediately recovered himself. "Monsieur," he said, "I placed the letter on the very place I told you, and I ask only half an hour to prove to you that the letter is in Mademoiselle de la Valliere's hand, or to bring you back the letter itself." Aramis looked at the valet scrutinizingly. Fouquet was ready in placing confidence in people, and for 20 years this man had served him faithfully. "Go," he said, "but bring me the proof you speak of." The lackey quitted the room. "Well, what do you make of it?" inquired Fouquet of Aramis. "I think that you must, by some means or another, assure yourself of the truth, either that the letter has, or has not, reached La Valliere; that, in the first case, La Valliere must return it to you, or satisfy you by burning it in your presence; that, in the second, you must have the letter back again, even if it were to cost you 1,000,000. Come, is not that your opinion?" "Yes; but still, my dear bishop, I believe you are exaggerating the importance of the affair." "Blind! How blind you are!" murmured Aramis. "La Valliere," returned Fouquet, "whom we assume to be a schemer of the first ability, is simply nothing more than a coquette, who hopes that I shall pay my court to her, because I have already done so, and who, now that she has received a confirmation of the king's regard, hopes to keep me in leading strings with a letter. It is natural enough." Aramis shook his head. "Is not that your opinion?" said Fouquet. "She is not a coquette," he replied. "Allow me to tell you—" "Oh, I am well enough acquainted with women who are coquettes," said Aramis. "My dear friend—" "It is a long time ago since I finished my education, you mean; but women are the same throughout the centuries." "True; but men change, and you at the present day are far more suspicious than you formerly were." And then, beginning to laugh, he added, "Come, if La Valliere is willing to love me only to the extent of a third, and the king 2/3, do you think the condition acceptable?" Aramis rose impatiently. "La Valliere," he said, "has never loved, and never will love any one but the king." "At all events," said Fouquet, "what would you do?" "Ask me rather what I would have done." "Well, what would you have done?" "In the first place, I should not have allowed that man to depart." "Toby?" "Yes, Toby is a traitor; nay, I am sure of it; and I would not have let him go until he told me the truth." "There is still time; I will recall him." "And do you question him in your own turn." "Agreed." "But I assure you it is useless. He has been with me for 20 years, and has never made the slightest mistake; and yet," added Fouquet, laughing, "it would have been easy enough for him to have done so." "Still, call him back. This morning I fancy I saw that face, in earnest conversation with one of M. Colbert's men." "Where was that?" "Opposite the stables." "Bah! all my men are daggers drawn with that fellow." "I saw him, I tell you, and his face, which should have been unknown to me when he entered just now, struck me as disagreeably familiar." "Why did you not say something, then, while he was here?" because it is only at this very minute that my memory is clear enough upon the subject." "Really," said Fouquet, "you alarm me." And he again rang the bell. "Provided that it is not already too late," said Aramis. Fouquet once more rang impatiently. The valet usually in attendance appeared. "Toby," said Fouquet, "send Toby." The valet again shut the door. "You leave me at perfect liberty, I assume?" "Entirely so." "I may employ all means, then, to ascertain the truth?" "All." "Intimidation, even?" "I constitute you public prosecutor in my place." They waited 10 minutes longer, but uselessly; and Fouquet, thoroughly out of patience, again rang loudly. "Toby!" he exclaimed. "Monsieur," said the valet, "they are looking for him." "He cannot be far distant. I have not given him any commission to execute." "I will go and see, monsieur," replied the valet, as he closed the door. Aramis, during the interview, walked impatiently, but without a syllable, up and down the cabinet. They waited a further 10 minutes. Fouquet rang in a manner to alarm the very dead. The valet again presented himself, trembling in a way to induce a belief that he was the bearer of bad news. "Monseigneur is mistaken," he said, before even Fouquet could interrogate him. "You must have given Toby some commission, for he has been to the stables, and taken your lordship's swiftest horse, and saddled it himself." "Well?" "And he has gone off." "Gone!" exclaimed Fouquet. "Let him be pursued, let him be captured." "Nay, nay," whispered Aramis, taking him by the hand. "Be calm. The evil is done." The valet quietly went out. "The evil is done, you say?" "No doubt, I was sure of it. And now let us give no cause for suspicion. We must calculate the result of the blow, and ward it off if possible." "After all," said Fouquet, "the evil is not great." "You think so?" said Aramis. "Of course. Surely a man is allowed to write a love letter to a woman." "A man, certainly; a subject, no; especially, too, when the woman in question is one with whom the king is in love. But the king was not in love with La Valliere a week ago; he was not in love with her yesterday, and the letter is dated yesterday. I could not guess the king was in love, when the king's affection was not even yet in existence." "As you please," replied Aramis; "but unfortunately the letter is not dated, and it is that circumstance particularly which annoys me. If it had only been dated yesterday, I should not have had the slightest shadow of uneasiness on your account." Fouquet shrugged his shoulders. "Am I not my own master?" he said; "and is the king, then, king of my brain and of my flesh?" "You are right," replied Aramis. "Do not let us attach greater importance to matters than is necessary. And besides, well, if we are menaced, we have means of defense." "Oh, menaced!" said Fouquet. "You do not place this gnat bite, as it were, among the number of menaces which may compromise my fortune and my life, do you? Do not forget, Monsieur Fouquet, that the bite of an insect can kill a giant if the insect be venomous." "But has this sovereign power you were speaking of already vanished?" "I am all powerful, it is true, but I am not immortal." "Come, then, the most pressing matter is to find Toby again, I suppose. Is not that your opinion?" "Oh, as to that, you will not find him again," said Aramis; "and if he were of any great value to you, you must give him up for lost." "At all events, he is somewhere or other in the world," said Fouquet. "You're right; let me act," replied Aramis. Chapter 64. Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 64. Madame's Four Chances. Anne of Austria had begged the young queen to pay her a visit. For some time past, suffering most acutely, and losing both her youth and beauty with that rapidity which signalizes the decline of women for whom life has been one long contest, Anne of Austria had, in addition to her physical sufferings, to experience the bitterness of being no longer held in any esteem, except as a surviving remembrance of the past, amidst the youthful beauties, wits, and influential forces of her court. Her physician's opinions, her mirror also, grieved her far less than the inexorable warnings which the society of the courtiers afforded, who, like rats in a ship, abandon the hold, into which on the very next voyage the water will infallibly penetrate, owing to the ravages of decay. Anne of Austria did not feel satisfied with the time her eldest son devoted to her. The king, a good son, more from affectation than from affection, had at first been in the habit of passing an hour in the morning and one in the evening with his mother; but, since he had himself undertaken the conduct of state affairs, the duration of the morning and evening's visits had been reduced by one half, and then, by degree, the morning visit had been suppressed altogether. They met at mass. The evening visit was replaced by a meeting, either at the king's assembly or at Madame's, which the queen attended obligingly enough, out of regard to her two sons. The result of this was, that Madame gradually acquired an immense influence over the court, which made her apartments the true royal place of meeting. This, Anne of Austria perceived. Knowing herself to be very ill, and condemned by her sufferings to frequent retirement, she was distressed by the idea that the greatest part of her future days and evenings would pass away solitary, useless, and in despondency. She recalled with terror the isolation in which Cardinal Richelieu had formerly left her, those dreaded and insupportable evenings, during which, however, she had both youth and beauty, which are ever accompanied by hope, to console her. She next formed the project of transporting the court to her own apartments, and of attracting Madame, with her brilliant escort, to her gloomy and already sorrowful abode, where the widow of a king of France, and the mother of a king of France, was reduced to console, in her artificial widowhood, the weeping wife of a king of France. Anne began to reflect. She had intrigued a good deal in her life. In the good times past, when her youthful mind nursed projects that were, ultimately, invariably successful, she had by her side, to stimulate her ambition and her love, a friend of her own sex, more eager, more ambitious than herself, a friend who had loved her, a rare circumstance at courts, and whom some petty considerations had removed from her forever. But for many years past, except Madame la Motteville, and La Molina, her Spanish nurse, a confidant in her character of countryman and woman too, who could boast of having given good advice to the queen? Who, too, among all the youthful heads there, could recall the past for her, that past in which alone she lived? Anne of Austria remembered Madame la Chevreuse, in the first place exiled rather by her wish than the king's, and then dying in exile, the wife of a gentleman of obscure birth and position. She asked herself what Madame la Chevreuse would have advised her to do in similar circumstances, in their mutual difficulties arising from their intrigues; and after serious reflection, it seemed as if the clever, subtle mind of her friend, full of experience and sound judgment, answered her, in the well remembered ironical tones: "All the insignificant young people are poor and greedy of gain. They require gold and incomes to supply means of amusement. It is by interest you must gain them over." And Anne of Austria adopted this plan. Her purse was well filled, and she had at her disposal a considerable sum of money, which had been amassed by Mazarin for her, and lodged in a place of safety. She possessed the most magnificent jewels in France, and especially pearls of a size so large that they made the king sigh every time he saw them, because the pearls of his crown were like millet seed compared to them. Anne of Austria had neither beauty nor charms any longer at her disposal. She gave out, therefore, that her wealth was great, and as an inducement for others to visit her apartments, she let it be known that there were good gold crowns to be won at play, or that handsome presents were likely to be made on days when all went well with her, or windfalls in the size of annuities which she had wrung from the king by entreaty, and thus she determined to maintain her credit. In the first place, she tried these means upon Madame, because to gain her consent was of more importance than anything else. Madame, notwithstanding the bold confidence which her wit and beauty inspired her, blindly ran head foremost into the net that stretched out to catch her. Enriched by degrees by these presents and transfers of property, she took a fancy to inheritances by anticipation. Anne of Austria adopted the same means towards Monsieur, and even towards the king himself. She instituted lotteries in her apartments. The day on which the present chapter opens, invitations had been issued for a late supper in the queen mother's apartments, as she intended that two beautiful diamond bracelets of an exquisite workmanship should be put into a lottery. The medallions were antique cameos of the greatest value. The diamonds, in point of intrinsic value, did not represent a very considerable amount, but the originality and rarity of the workmanship was such, that every one at court not only wished to possess the bracelets, but even to see the queen herself wear them, for on days she wore them, it was considered as a favor to be admitted to admire them in kissing her hands. The courtiers had, even with regard to this subject, adopted various expressions of gallantry to establish the aphorism, that the bracelets would have been priceless in value, if they had not been unfortunate enough to be placed in contact with arms as beautiful as the queen's. This compliment had been honored by a translation into all the languages of Europe, and numerous verses in Latin and French had been circulated on the subject. The day that Anne of Austria had selected for the lottery was a decisive moment. The king had not been near his mother for a couple of days. Madame, after the great scene of the Dryads and Naiads, was sulking by herself. It is true, the king's fit of resentment was over, but his mind was absorbingly occupied by a circumstance that raised him above the stormy disputes and giddy pleasures of the court. Anne of Austria effected a diversion by the announcement of the famous lottery to take place in her apartments on the following evening. With this object in view, she saw the young queen, whom, as we have already seen, she had invited to pay her a visit in the morning. "I have good news to tell you," she said to her. "The king has been saying the most tender things about you. He is young, you know, and easily drawn away; but so long as you keep near me, he will not venture to keep away from you, to whom, besides, he is most warmly and affectionately attached. I intend to have a lottery this evening, and shall expect to see you." "I have heard," said the young queen, with a sort of timid reproach, "that your majesty intends to put in the lottery those lovely bracelets whose rarity is so great that we ought not to allow them to pass out of the custody of the crown, even though there were no other reason than that they once belonged to you." "My daughter," said Anne of Austria, who read the young queen's thoughts, and wished to console her for not having received the bracelets as a present, "it is positively necessary that I should induce Madame to pass her time in my apartments." "Madame?" said the young queen, blushing. "Of course. Would you not prefer to have a rival near you, whom you could watch and influence, to knowing the king is with her, always as ready to flirt as to be flirted with by her? The lottery I proposed is my means of attraction for the purpose. Do you blame me?" "Oh, no!" returned Maria Theresa, clapping her hands with a childlike expression of delight. "And you no longer regret, then, that I do not give you these bracelets, as I first intended to do?" "Oh, no, no!" "Very well. Make yourself look as beautiful as possible, that our supper may be very brilliant. The gayer you seem, the more charming you appear, and you will eclipse all the ladies present as much by your brilliancy as by your rank." Maria Theresa left full of delight. An hour afterwards Anne of Austria received a visit from Madame, whom she covered with caresses, saying, "Excellent news! The king is charmed with my lottery." "But I," replied Madame, "am not so greatly charmed. To see such beautiful bracelets on any one's arms but yours or mine, is what I cannot reconcile myself to." "Well, well," said Anne of Austria, concealing by a smile a violent pang she had just experienced, "do not look at things in the worst light immediately. Ah, madame, fortune is blind, and I am told there are 200 tickets." "Quite as many as that. But you cannot surely forget that there can only be one winner." "No doubt; but who will that be? Can you tell?" said Madame in despair. "You remind me that I had a dream last night. My dreams are always good, I sleep so little." "What was your dream? And are you suffering?" "No," said the queen, stifling with wonderful command the torture of a renewed attack of shooting pains in her bosom. "I dreamed that the king won the bracelets." "The king! You are going to ask me, I think, what the king could possibly do with the bracelets?" "Yes." "And you would not add, perhaps, that it would be very fortunate if the king were really to win, for he would be obliged to give the bracelets to some one else. To restore them to you, for instance? In which case I should immediately give them away. For you do not think, I suppose," said the queen, laughing, "that I have put these bracelets up to a lottery from necessity. My object was to give them without arousing any one's jealousy. But if fortune will not get me out of my difficulty, well, I will teach fortune a lesson. And I know very well to whom I intend to offer the bracelets." These words were accompanied by so expressive a smile, that Madame could not resist paying her by a grateful kiss. "But," added Anne of Austria, "do you not know, as well as I do, that if the king were to win the bracelets, he would not restore them to me?" "You mean he would give them to the queen?" "No; and for the very same reason that he would not give them back again to me, since, if I had wished to make the queen a present of them, I had no need of him for that purpose." Madame cast a side glance upon the bracelets, which, in their casket, were dazzlingly exposed to view upon a table close beside her. "How beautiful they are!" she said, sighing. "But stay," Madame continued, "we are quite forgetting that your majesty's dream was nothing but a dream." "I should be very much surprised," returned Anne of Austria, "if my dream were to deceive me. That has happened to me very seldom." "We may look upon you as a prophetess, then?" "I have already said that I dream but very rarely. But the coincidence of my dream about this matter with my own views is extraordinary. It agrees so wonderfully with my own views and arrangements." "What arrangements do you allude to?" "That you will get the bracelets, for instance." "In that case it will not be the king." "Oh," said Anne of Austria, "there is not such a very great distance between his majesty's heart and your own; for, are you not his sister, for whom he has a great regard? There is not, I repeat, so very wide a distance, that my dream can be pronounced false on that account. Come, let us reckon up the chances in its favor. I will count them. In the first place, we will begin with the dream. If the king wins, he is sure to give you the bracelets. I admit that as one. If you win them, they are yours. Naturally, That may be admitted also. Lastly, if Monsieur were to win them—" "Oh," said Madame, laughing heartily, "he would give them to the Chevalier de Lorraine." Anne of Austria laughed as heartily as her daughter-in-law; so much so, indeed, that her sufferings again returned, and made her turn suddenly pale in the very midst of her enjoyment. "What is the matter?" inquired Madame, terrified. "Nothing, nothing; a pain in my side. I have been laughing too much. We were at the fourth chance, I think." "I cannot see a fourth. I beg your pardon. I am not excluded from the chance of winning; and if I be the winner, you are sure of me." "Oh, thank you, thank you!" exclaimed Madame. "I hope that you look upon yourself as one whose chances are good, and that my dream now begins to assume the solid outlines of reality." "Yes, indeed, you give me both hope and confidence," said Madame; "and the bracelets, won in this manner, will be 100 times more precious to me." "Well, then, good bye, until this evening." And the two princesses separated. Anne of Austria, after her daughter-in-law had left her, said to herself, as she examined the bracelets, "They are indeed precious, since by their means, this evening, I shall have won over a heart to my side, at the same time fathomed an important secret." Then, turning towards a deserted recess in her room, she said, addressing vacancy, "Is it not thus that you would have acted, my poor Chevreuse?" "Yes, yes, I know it is." And, like a perfume of other, fairer days, her youth, her imagination, and her happiness seemed to be wafted towards the echo of this invocation. Chapter 64. Recording by Todd. 5 of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 65. The Lottery. By 8 o'clock in the evening, every one had assembled in the queen mother's apartments. Anne of Austria, in full dress, beautiful still from former loveliness and from all the resources coquetry can command at the hands of clever assistants, concealed, or rather pretended to conceal, from the crowd of courtiers who surrounded her, and who still admired her, thanks to the combination of circumstances which we have indicated in the preceding chapter, the ravages, which were already visible, of the acute suffering to which she finally yielded a few years later. Madame, almost as great a coquette as Anne of Austria, and the queen, simple and natural as usual, were seated beside her, each contending for her good graces. The ladies of honor, united in a body, in order to resist with greater effect, and consequently with more success, the witty and lively conversations which the young men held about them, were enabled, like a battalion formed in a square, to offer each other the means of attack and defense which were thus at their command. Montalais, learned in that species of warfare which consists of sustained skirmishing, protected the whole line by a sort of rolling fire she directed against the enemy. Saint Aignan, in utter despair at the rigor, which became almost insulting from the very fact of her persisting in it, Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente displayed, tried to turn his back upon her, but, overcome by the irresistible brilliancy of her eyes, he, every moment, returned to consecrate his defeat by new submissions, to which Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente did not fail to reply by fresh acts of impertinence. Saint Aignan did not know which way to turn. La Valliere had about her, not exactly a court, but sprinklings of courtiers. Saint Aignan, hoping by this maneuver to attract Athenais' attention towards him, approached the young girl, and saluted her with a respect that induced some to believe that he wished to balance Athenais by Louise. But these were persons who had neither been witnesses of the scene during the shower, nor had heard it spoken of. As the majority was already informed, and well informed too, on the matter, the acknowledged favor with which she was regarded had attracted to her side some of the most astute, as well as the least sensible members of the court. The former, because they said with Montaigne, "How do I know?" and the latter, who said with Rabelais, "Perhaps." The greatest number had followed in the wake of the latter, just as in hunting 5 or 6 of the best hounds alone follow the scent of the animal hunted, while the remainder of the pack follow only the scent of the hounds. The two queens and Madame examined with particular attention the toilettes of their ladies and maids of honor, and they condescended to forget they were queens in recollecting that they were women. In other words, they pitilessly picked to pieces every person present who wore a petticoat. The looks of both princesses simultaneously fell upon La Valliere, who, as we have just said, was completely surrounded at the moment. Madame knew not what pity was, and said to the queen mother, as she turned towards her, if fortune were just, she would favor that poor La Valliere. "That is not possible," said the queen mother, smiling. "Why not?" "There are only 200 tickets, so that it was not possible to inscribe every one's name on the list." "And hers is not there, then?" "No." "What a pity! She might have won them, and then sold them." "Sold them!" exclaimed the queen. "Yes, it would have been a dowry for her, and she would not have been obliged to marry without her trousseau, as will probably be the case." "Really!" answered the queen mother. "Poor little thing! Has she no dresses, then?" And she pronounced these words like a woman who has never been able to understand the inconvenience of a slenderly filled purse. "Stay, look at her! Heaven forgive me if she is not wearing the very same petticoat this evening that she had on this morning during the promenade, and which she managed to keep clean, thanks to the care the king took of her in sheltering her from the rain." At the very moment Madame uttered these words, the king entered the room. The two queens would not perhaps have observed his arrival, so completely were they occupied in their ill natured remarks, had not Madame noticed that, all at once, La Valliere, who was standing up facing the gallery, exhibited certain signs of confusion, and then said a few words to the courtiers who surrounded her, who immediately dispersed. This movement induced Madame to look towards the door, and at that moment the captain of the guards announced the king. At this moment La Valliere, who had hitherto kept her eyes fixed upon the gallery, suddenly cast them down as the king entered. His majesty was dressed magnificently, and in the most perfect taste. He was conversing with Monsieur and the Duc de Roquelaure, Monsieur on his right, and the Duc de Rollet on his left. The king advanced, in the first place towards the queens, to whom he bowed with an air full of graceful respect. He took his mother's hand and kissed it, addressed a few compliments to Madame upon the beauty of her toilette, and then began to make the round of the assembly. La Valliere was saluted in the same manner as the others, but with neither more nor less attention. His majesty then returned to his mother and his wife. When the courtiers noticed that the king had only addressed some ordinary remark to the young girl who had been so particularly noticed in the morning, they immediately drew their own conclusion to account for this coldness of manner; this conclusion being, that although the king may have taken a sudden fancy to her, that fancy had already disappeared. One thing, however, must be remarked, that close beside La Valliere, among the number of the courtiers, M. Fouquet was to be seen, and his respectfully attentive manner served to sustain the young girl in the midst of the varied emotions that visibly agitated her. M. Fouquet was just on the point, moreover, of speaking in a more friendly manner with Mademoiselle de la Valliere, when M. Colbert approached, and after having bowed to Fouquet with all the formality of respectful politeness, he seemed to take up a post beside La Valliere, for the purpose of entering into conversation with her. Fouquet immediately quitted his place. These proceedings were eagerly devoured by the eyes of Montalais and Malicorne, who mutually exchanged their observations on the subject. De Guiche, standing within the embrasure of one of the windows, saw no one but Madame. But as Madame, on her side, frequently glanced at La Valliere, De Guiche's eyes, following Madame's, were from time to time cast upon the young girl. La Valliere instinctively felt herself sinking beneath the weight of all these different looks, inspired, some by interest, others by envy. She had nothing to compensate her for her suffering, not a kind word from her companions, not a look of affection from the king. No one could possibly express the misery the poor girl was suffering. The queen mother next directed the small table to be brought forward, on which the lottery tickets were placed, 200 in number, and begged Madame de Motteville to read the list of the names. It was a matter of course that this list had been drawn out in strict accordance with the laws of etiquette. The king's name was first on the list, next the queen mother, then the queen, Monsieur, Madame, and so on. All hearts throbbed anxiously as the list was read out. More than 300 persons had been invited, and each of them was anxious to learn whether his or her name was to be found in the number of privileged names. The king listened with as much attention as the others, and when the last name had been pronounced, he noticed that La Valliere had been omitted from the list. Every one, of course, remarked this omission. The king flushed as if much annoyed, but La Valliere, gentle and resigned, as usual, exhibited nothing of the sort. While the list was being read, the king had not taken his eyes off the young girl, who seemed to expand, as it were, beneath the happy influence she felt was shed around her, and who was delighted, and too pure in spirit for any other thought than that of love to find an entrance either to her mind or her heart. Acknowledging this touching semi-denial by the fixity of his attention, the king showed La Valliere how much he appreciated its delicacy. When the list was finished, the different faces of those who had been omitted or forgotten fully expressed their disappointment. Malicorne was also left out from amongst the men, and the grimace he made plainly said to Montalais, who was also forgotten, "Can we not contrive to arrange matters with fortune in such a manner that she will not forget us?" To which a smile full of intelligence from Mademoiselle Aure replied, "Certainly we can." The tickets were distributed to each according to the number listed. The king received his first, next the queen mother, then Monsieur, then the queen and Madame, and so on. After this, Anne of Austria opened a small Spanish leather bag, containing 200 numbers engraved upon small balls of mother of pearl, and presented the open sack to the youngest of her maids of honor, for the purpose of taking one of the balls out of it. The eager expectation of the throng, amidst all the tediously slow preparations, was rather that of cupidity than curiosity. Saint Aignan bent towards Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente to whisper to her, "Since we each have a number, let us unite our two chances. The bracelet shall be yours if I win, and if you are successful, deign to give me but one look of your beautiful eyes." "No," said Athenais, "if you win the bracelet, keep it, every one for himself." "You are without any pity," said Saint Aignan, "and I will punish you by a quatrain. Beautiful Iris, to my vows you are too opposed." "Silence," said Athenais, "you will prevent me hearing the winning number." "Number one," said the young girl who had drawn the mother of pearl from the Spanish leather bag. "The king!" exclaimed the queen mother. "The king has won!" repeated the queen, delightedly. "Oh, the king! Your dream!" said Madame, joyously, in the ear of Anne of Austria. The king was the only one who did not exhibit any satisfaction. He merely thanked fortune for what she had done for him, in addressing a slight salutation to the young girl who had been chosen as her proxy. Then receiving from the hands of Anne of Austria, amid the eager desire of the whole assembly, the casket enclosing the bracelets, he said, "Are these bracelets really beautiful, then?" "Look at them," said Anne of Austria, "and judge for yourself." The king looked at them, and said, "Yes, indeed, an admirable medallion. What perfect finish!" Queen Maria Theresa easily saw, and that too at the very first glance, that the king would not offer the bracelets to her; but, as he did not seem the least degree in the world disposed to offer them to Madame, she felt almost satisfied, or nearly so. The king sat down. The most intimate among the courtiers approached, one by one, for the purpose of admiring more closely the beautiful piece of workmanship, which soon, with the king's permission, was handed about from person to person. Immediately every one, connoisseurs or not, uttered various exclamations of surprise, and overwhelmed the king with congratulations. There was, in fact, something for everybody to admire, the brilliance for some, and the cutting for others. The ladies present visibly displayed their impatience to see such a treasure monopolized by the gentlemen. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," said the king, whom nothing escaped, "one would almost think that you wore bracelets as the Sabines used to. Hand them round for a while for the inspection of the ladies, who seem to have, and with far greater right, an excuse for understanding such matters." These words appeared to Madame the commencement of a decision she expected. She gathered, besides, this happy belief from the glances of the queen mother. The courtier who held them at the moment the king made this remark, amidst the general agitation, hastened to place the bracelets in the hands of the queen, Maria Theresa, who, knowing too well, poor woman, that they were not designed for her, hardly looked at them, and almost immediately passed them on to Madame. The latter, and even more minutely Monsieur, gave the bracelets a long look of anxious and almost covetous desire. She then handed the jewels to those ladies who were near her, pronouncing this single word, but with an accent which was worth a long phrase, "Magnificent!" The ladies who had received the bracelets from Madame's hands looked at them as long as they chose to examine them, and then made them circulate by passing them onwards towards the right. During this time the king was tranquilly conversing with De Guiche and Fouquet, rather passively letting them talk than himself listening. Accustomed to the set form of ordinary phrases, his ear, like that of all men who exercise an incontestable superiority over others, merely selected from the conversations held in various directions the indispensable word which requires reply. His attention, however, was now elsewhere, for it wandered as his eyes did. Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente was the last of the ladies inscribed for the tickets, and, as if she had ranked according to her name upon the list, she had only Montalais and La Valliere near her. When the bracelets reached these latter two, no one appeared to take any further notice of them. The humble hands which for a moment touched these jewels, deprived them, for a time, of their importance, a circumstance which did not, however, prevent Montalais from starting with joy, envy, and covetous desire at the sight of the beautiful stones still more than at their magnificent workmanship. It is evident that if she were compelled to decide between the pecuniary value and the artistic beauty, Montalais would unhesitatingly have preferred diamonds to cameos, and her disinclination, therefore, to pass them on to her companion, La Valliere, was very great. La Valliere fixed a look almost of indifference upon the jewels. "Oh, how beautiful, how magnificent these bracelets are!" exclaimed Montalais. "And yet you do not go in ecstasies about them, Louise? You are no true woman, I am sure." "Yes, I am indeed," replied the young girl, with an accent of the most charming melancholy; "but why desire that which can never, by any possibility, be ours?" The king, his head bent forward, was listening to what Louise was saying. Hardly had the vibration of her voice reached his ear, than he rose, radiant with delight, and passing across the whole assembly, from the place where he stood to La Valliere, "You are mistaken, mademoiselle," he said. "You are a woman, and every woman has a right to wear jewels, which are a woman's appurtenance." "Oh, sire," said La Valliere, "your majesty will not absolutely believe in my modesty?" "I believe you possess every virtue, mademoiselle, frankness as well as every other. I entreat you, therefore, to say frankly what you think of these bracelets." "That they are beautiful, sire, and cannot be offered to any other than a queen." "I am delighted that such is your opinion, mademoiselle. The bracelets are yours, and the king begs your acceptance of them." And as, with a movement almost resembling terror, La Valliere eagerly held out the casket to the king gently pushed back her trembling hand. A silence of astonishment, more profound than that of death, reigned in the assembly. And yet, from the side where the queens were, no one had heard what he had said, nor understood what he had done. A charitable friend, however, took upon herself to spread the news. It was Tonnay Charente, to whom Madame made a sign to approach. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Tonnay Charente, "how happy that Valliere is! The king has just given her the bracelets." Madame bit her lips to such a degree that the blood appeared upon the surface of the skin. The young queen looked first at La Valliere, and then at Madame, and began to laugh. Anne of Austria rested her chin upon her beautiful white hand, and remained for a long time absorbed by a presentiment that disturbed her mind, and by a terrible pang which stung her heart. De Guiche, observing Madame turn pale, and guessing the cause of her changing color, abruptly quitted the assembly and disappeared. Malicorne was then able to approach Montalais very quietly, and under cover of the general din of conversation said to her, "Auray, your fortune and our fortune are standing at your elbow." "Yes," was her reply, as she tenderly embraced La Valliere, whom, inwardly, she was tempted to strangle. Chapter 65. Recording by Todd. End of 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas.